So I intended to do this at the beginning of the reading. I'm going to do it now. I think we could probably do this for the rest of time, but acknowledgments. These poems do too little to acknowledge the persistent and historical damage done to the tribes who are the rightful stewards of the territories in which they were written. These include the lands of the Dene, Zuni, Pueblo, Lenape, Wappinger, Canarsie, Matonic, and Nauset tribes. Over 70 years ago, my family arrived in Dene territory as missionaries, and I am particularly troubled by their part in the erasure of these cultures, languages, and communities of the people who live there. I know too well the insufficiency of good intentions. This acknowledgement does nothing to remediate my family's part in this colonial project. All right. So I've been trying to understand this poem, something I wrote a decade ago. Not just the content of it, but what I meant by it, what it means about me, how every word arrived at the page as a sigh, as if sotto voce had been inscribed between the lines. How my breath, humectant when I read it, seemed freighted with pollen, the air clotted with light. For it was in its every fiber an ode or reverie, a paean to spring. And apropos of that fertile season, my mother in the poem was pregnant, seemingly for the first time, and presumably with me. Or, as I put it in its first couplet, something blooms in my mother. Under the covers, she is a field of wild flowers. While I find these lines, sanguine as they are, alarming enough in themselves, what's stranger still is how the poem seems to be set vaguely in the desert. How already my father, a few couplets later, is a minister newly frocked, tending to his first flock, though in actuality he was ordained many years earlier, and I am neither the oldest nor only child. Yet in its 8 confected pages, there's nary a whisper of my siblings, of whom there are 6. Some of them are in Zoom right now. No J or A who were born before me, nor C who arrived a few years after, no M or L who are adopted Inuit and sisters by blood themselves, nor B who, smelling like a river, came to us much later from an orphanage in Addis Ababa for children whose parents had died of AIDS. No, in lieu of this brood, there's only inchoate little me and my father and mother, and of course this covert erasure. So what's clear from the start is that whatever it sought, it wasn't the truth, though in its name, Auscultation, it certainly pretended at it, as if listening nakedly for it. Just as the father, who, let's admit, isn't really my father, presses his cool ear there to listen, as a chain of daisies in her hair on their wedding day comes unlinked, and a gamete in the wall drifts clean and splits, as if he could hear that gooey detachment, my mitosis, the delicate beach ball of my blastula bouncing free. But in the poem's logic, it's this tender and domestic fabulation, him listening to her tummy in bed with me in it, that for some reason reminds him of his days spent at United Nuclear in the uranium mines. How he, itinerant of the dark, felt a mile deep in a stoner's reverie, the heat of the earth molten through a curtain of dirt and heavy metals. And later, as a metaphor of birth, my birth, I think, or of resurrection maybe, he recalls rising up with the other workers on elevators as big as houses toward the light of sunset, where bugs crackled in the haze like flecks of static, as bats swooned acrobatically in among them, keening their early evening orrery. And I remember, as I wrote this, imagining how, with only the gelid light of bitumen lamps to see by, dawn and dusk must have been to them but a slim parenthesis, delimiting night from day, eliding the scene of him breathing his breath into the man already dead who'd been thrown free of the truck, breaking his neck as the ambulance flew from the mine to the hospital. As the poem imagines instead the relief he must have felt to wake before dawn on Sunday mornings, years later, to prepare the word of the Lord. While my mother in the poem spends all her time sort of basking in stained glass light, totally emulsified in a dispersion of motes, as she arranges lilies below his pulpit on oak boxes in damask, even though she was a nurse in real life and probably worked harder than he. It's almost funny now to think of me then, with dewy, voluminous eyes upturned and belladonna bright, laboring over each line and metaphor. But what's altogether uncanny to me now is the sermon I composed for him to preach. How I even went so far as to pretend I'd transcribed it, dusting off a 3M Metafine cassette dated 5/13/1984, Easter Sunday, I calculated, 6 months before I was born, inserting in the midst of his homily lines like, "He pauses here, I've heard it," as if it came straight from the archive, as if asked in a court of law, I could produce it, corroborating its existence. But that sermon, it's as false as the idol itself, somehow mine but not mine. Look out the window now and see the kingdom of heaven and the glory of earth, spoken ex nihilo into being. One body, one spirit, nothing is apart from the whole. Consider, for instance, the bee, then listen to your heart, hive-ripe, honey-wise, and womb-like. Consider each cell a hexwork of buzz and cortex and matrix of comb. Like the queen, you are more than the angel at the center of this rind. Listen to the drone and waddles and folds, the volt by volt of synapses fluttering. The pallium of drones knows the body beyond the husk. It is a lullaby sung by a larynx in figments, a lexicon in movement. The hymn and hum of a living body. Press your ear there and feel the throb of songs sung to outlying organs. Every murmur, a servitude. It cannot quit. Even a rhythmic, the heart seduces the body. I mean, Jesus. So the bees, they're the congregation, and the hive, the church. I get that. But they're also the workers, right? And the mind's the hive, their smell, her smell, I think. The honeyed smell of labor and lover's sweat, the earth and iron odor of afterbirth. But the hive is me too, in utero, I think, the gametes, hexwork of cells, etc. Whereas the hive, the womb, and we, my absent brothers and sisters, we're the bees? Anyway, I remember thinking, and this is the height of my delusion, that readers may see in an ampersand and parentheses a visual echo of the fetus in our belly. Because the bees, aren't they also my mother? Like her, they are one with the field of wildflowers. And the Holy Spirit, presumably, she's the queen. But what is as yet incomprehensible to me is what this ventriloquism means. I mean, I don't know. Am I speaking through my father, or is he speaking through me? I think I thought the sermon should be about her, about us, together, inseparable. Nothing to do with any dogma, only the hidden doctrines of motherhood. And as I analyzed this poem, I fortuitously came upon Donald Winnicott's unthinkable anxieties of a newborn, which are as follows. 1, going to pieces. 2, falling forever. 3, having no relationship to the body. And 4, having no orientation. But what I find striking and yes, enigmatic about this list is how the poem seems to be an encomium to the pleasure of going to pieces, of loss of self, as it relates to newborns particularly, the loss of at least perceivable order, or a tribute to maternity's profound reordering. But of the many sermons I've heard my father actually preach, there's one fragment I remember more vividly than any other, even while the point, the metaphor's tenor, the moral of the story, as there certainly must have been one, remains elusive to me. All that I remember is the central illustration of a comic strip in which our hero trips over a sign with the words "bottomless pit" emblazoned upon it, and is sent hurtling down through the funny pages into the dark weeks ahead. In my father's telling, day by day, 3 panels at a time, with no thought or speech bubbles trailing away behind him, the tears that once sped down his face run dry, leaving tracks on his cheeks as they grow wan, then sallow, as his hair grows long and beard fills in, whipping away behind him, leaving me in the pew to wonder, did others follow after, too distant to matter, too far away to call out to? As his pants are raveled down to rags and his shirt, like a flag flung into the void, dissolves, revealing his ribs. Weren't there at least moments of relief, brief interludes of abandon? Even as he's reduced to a speeding skeleton, mightn't some kind of philosophy have developed, however primitive, an ontology of the fall? While from the pulpit, according to my father, his bones were frittered away to fragments, and the fragments winnowed down to dust.